Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you all for coming for the second lecture of our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. I am Professor Daniel Simão Nascimento, the organizer of the symposium and the host for this meeting. As usual, I'd like to thank FAPERJ and CAPES for their Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. I am Professor Daniel Simão Nascimento, the organizer of the symposium and the host for this meeting. As usual, I'd like to thank FAPERJ and CAPES for their Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. I am Professor Daniel Simão Nascimento, the organizer of the symposium and the host. I'm sorry, this sound came back to me. I had to turn something off here. Let me take it back. As usual, I'd like to thank FAPERJ and CAPES for their financial support and the members of the research group Pragnosia and Polyphonia for their academic support. Today, we're joined by Professor Breno Zuppolini, who is the lead in our lecture. And to debate with Professor Zuppolini, we have Professor Lucas Angioni from Unicamp, Professor Rodrigo Guerizoli from UFRJ, and Professor Roberto Grasso from UFPB. Without any more delay, then I welcome Professor Zuppolini to our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. Breno, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm assuming that you can see my presentation now. So first of all, thank you for putting together this series of lectures, and I'm truly honored to be part of such a distinguished list of speakers, and I'm really, really grateful for your presence, for the presence of the audience as well. Okay. Today I will be talking about Aristotle's discussion of change in the third book of the Physics. And I'm currently preparing a translation with comments of Aristotle's discussion of change, the first 3 chapters of the third book, a translation to Portuguese with comments. And the paper that I am presenting today is a sort of byproduct of this project. Okay, having said that, let me begin by remembering you that Aristotle's discussion of change in the third book depends on his account of change in the first book of the Physics, in which Aristotle identifies in any change 3 basic elements. One element is what Aristotle calls the hypokeimenon, the underlying subject, and the other 2 elements are a pair of contrary attributes. So, for instance, when a child grows, the child is first short and then becomes tall. The child is the underlying subject. Being short and being tall are the contrary predicates, right? Okay, having said that, we can move on to Aristotle's definition of change, or at least the first version of the definition that appears in chapter 1. Is the famous definition of change as the actuality of that which potentially is qua such. And this is a very obscure piece of text. We all know that, and as such, it gives rise to a lot of controversy in the literature. And I'll try to first illuminate a little bit the controversy, the debate, by distinguishing between 2 questions. So the first question is what I would call the grammatical question that concerns the grammar of the definition. So the question is the following: what is the complement of dyname ontos in the definition, if there is one? So should we read dyname on as option A, to be potentially changing from one contrary state to the other, or option B, to be potentially in a given end state F? So these are the 2 main options that we have for the grammatical question. And I would like to distinguish the grammatical question from what I call the semantic question, which concerns not just the grammar of the definition, but the actual meaning of the definition. And the semantic question is the following one: is change defined as an entelecheia of option A, X is dynamis to change into F, or option B, X dynamis to be F? Of course, although these 2 questions can be distinguished, you can think that there are 2 natural, intuitive combinations of these 4 alternatives. And this, through more straightforward natural combinations, it gives us the two main interpretations available in the literature. So the first interpretation I will call an interpretation A, which is a combination of capital A as an answer to the grammatical question and lowercase a as an answer to the semantic question. And of course, this is a natural intuitive combination, because if we take the expression dynamic on as having as a complement something like kineton, so Aristotle is talking about the actuality of what is potentially changing, then it seems natural to take change as an entelecheia of the subject's capacity to change, right? And of course, another intuitive, straightforward combination is what I call interpretation B, which is a combination of capital B as an answer to the grammatical question and lowercase b as an answer to the semantic question. If we take the expression dynamic on, especially the participle on as predicative, and we take the complement of this predicative on as referring to any given state or predicate in any category, then it seems natural to take entelecheia or change as the entelecheia of a given subject's capacity to be in that end state, right? So if these are the two main options we have, why I am insisting in the distinction between these two questions? Because my proposal is rather a combination of capital B with lowercase a. So although I side with interpretation B when it comes to the grammatical question, I side with interpretation A when it comes to the semantic question. So I take the expression dynamic on to be predicative, and the complement to be any predicate in any category. So the complement of dynamic is not kineton, but any predicate in any category. And however, I take change to be the actuality of the subject's capacity to change. And of course, you may ask whether this is possible. And this sounds a little bit implausible as an attempt to read the text. At least it sounds a little bit incoherent as an approach to the text. And in order to show that this proposal is plausible, I will argue for what I will call the crucial move. What is my crucial move is the following. I think that X is potentially F is an ambiguous sentence scheme that can relate to different capacities with different categorical bases as the relevant proof maker, including X's capacity to change into F. Okay, that's my crucial move, and I'm going to defend it in a moment. Right? So first, I would like to begin by addressing the grammar question, so the grammatical question. And I'll start with a couple of auxiliary evidence. The first is the very prelude of the chapter. So Aristotle applies the notion of potentiality and actuality throughout the categories. And his point is that the process through which X becomes F replaces a state of affairs in which X is actually not F and potentially F for one in which X is actually F, where F and not F are predicates in the same category. Right, so the conceptual pair potentiality and actuality are applied to any value in any category, and is not just talking about having the potentiality to he's not thinking just of kineton as a complement of dynamion, but the complement is like assumed to be any predicate in any category. Okay. What is crucial here is that I think the very text of the definition mentions the beginning of the chapter. So Aristotle, in the very same sentence, he mentions that he has discriminated the actuality and the potentiality in each of the categories. Okay. So this is a good evidence that dynamion should have as a complement not specifically kineton, but any state or predicate in any category. Another evidence is that all the textually uncontroversial complements of dynamion in the chapter are predicates within a given category. For instance, hot and cold, statue, and so on. The only exception is kinetoi in A32, which is textually controversial. It's omitted in some manuscripts. And even if we have kinetoi in the text, it could be just a gloss of dynamitini, as Ross takes it to be. And therefore, it's not a complement of dynamion, but just a gloss of the expression. Kinetoi is also absent in the parallel text of the Metaphysics and is not read by Themistius and Philoponus. Now, what is a crucial evidence, I think, when it comes to the grammatical question, is 201A27-2B5, where Aristotle argues that the bronze is potentially a statue, and that it is not the actuality of bronze qua bronze that is change, implying that change is the actuality of bronze qua potentially a statue. So if the sculpting process is the actuality of bronze qua potentially a statue, the complement of the expression dynamion is something like statue, or the end state of the change, and not something like kineton. Okay. And now I mean, very briefly, what I think to be the main argument against interpretation A when it comes to the grammatical question. The argument, basically, the objection is the following one. If it seems that interpretation A reads the text with a sort of equivocation, and I will try to explain what that is more precisely. If we take the text of the definition of kinesis, the rest of the chapter in which the definition is employed, we can take a couple conclusions. First, in the definition, toiuton refers back to dyname ontos, right? So change is the actuality of what potentially is, qua being potentiality. And in other construes of the definition, kineton and aloiaton and similar expressions replace toiuton, and hence these expressions are equivalent to dyname on and not a complement of dyname on. So it seems it is a little bit strange to take kineton at the same time as a complement, as a replacement for toiuton, and therefore as something equivalent to dyname on, and at the same time take it to be a complement of the construal. Look at Heinemann's translations of the definitions of change in the physics, and Heinemann endorses interpretation A. For instance, 201A27-29, he translates a definition of change as the actuality of what potentially is qua changeable. But in 201A32-34, he translates the definition as the actuality of what potentially is changing, qua potentially changing. So Heinemann needs to change the translation of kineton in those in these two occurrences. There is a useful paper by Javier Sosa in which he makes a similar objection to Heinemann. And I think it's a good point against Heinemann's interpretation. But I take it to be an objection only against the grammar of the definition, as I will make it clear in a moment. Okay, this is all I have to say about the grammar of the definition. So again, I am siding with interpretation B when it comes to the grammar of the definition. I take dyname on to have as a complement a given predicate as a reference to the end state of the change, to be precise. So the sculpting process would be the actuality of the bronze qua potentially a statue. All right. of course, in order to sustain that answer to the grammatical question and my answer to the semantic question, I did what I call the crucial move, and I'm going to argue for it now. First, let me say that I think there is a good consensus in the debate. Right? And what is the good consensus? The good consensus is that, according to most, if not all, interpreters of Aristotle, sentences of the form X is potentially F don't simply express a modal claim, but attribute a concrete capacity or disposition to X. Okay, that's something I would like to explore in my paper. But there is also a bad consensus. And the bad consensus concerns the terms of the debate. More precisely, the distinction between a capacity to change in opposition to a capacity to be. And I would like to say that this distinction, I think, is a little bit ill-formulated. The first important thing to note is that for Aristotle, the active and passive capacities of X supervene on material properties that X actually possesses, i.e., capacities are individuated by their categorical basis. So for instance, what can be burned is oily, among other features, and what can burn is hot, among other features. So having noted that capacities are individuated by their categorical basis, by material properties that the subject actually possesses, then we should ask, whenever one traces the distinction between capacity to change and capacity to be, what constitutes a capacity to be? And what is the categorical basis of a capacity to be? And my answer to that question is that there is no such thing as a generic capacity to be. What I mean by that is that sentences of the form X is potentially F have different capacities with different categorical bases as possible truth makers. And I think that when people talk about capacity to be, they are talking about different kinds of capacities that should be distinguished once we surpass the mere linguistic level in which Aristotle just expressed his claims. For instance, in some contexts, Aristotle says that X is potentially F. What he means is that X's material constitution fully instantiates Fness. So if you take, for instance, when he's talking about ultimate or functional matter of a given form phi as potentially realizing phi, he's using the expression in this way, I think. So, for example, when he says that the organic body is potentially a human being or potentially alive as a human being, it means something like that the organic body is fully equipped to exercise human psychic activities. So Aristote's definition of so in the eminent one is an example of this expression being used in this way. And what is, I think, important for my present purposes here is to note that not all occurrences of X is potentially F denote a capacity incompatible with X as being actually F. And the relation between form and functional matter, as I have explained, is an instance of that use of potentiality and actuality. Another paradigmatic case is the relation between what Aristotle calls energeia in metaphysics theta in opposition to kineses, which I'm translating here as activities. The relation between activities and the corresponding capacities is a relation in which the actuality preserves the corresponding potentiality. So when I am walking, I at the same time preserve my capacity to walk. And I'm going to explore that result in a moment. So I'd like to just to stress that we should not take being potentially such and such and being actually such and such as incompatible features for Aristotle. And in several cases, this is the two things are perfectly compatible. All right. In other contexts, Aristotle uses this expression x is potentially f in a different way. He uses to say that given X's material constitution, there is one and only one active capacity whose exercises suffices to initiate the process through which X becomes F. Or in other words, when he says that X is potentially F, he means that X is capable of changing into F. And of course, I'm presupposing here Aristotle argues in theta, when he formulates a model for rational capacities and extend the model to non-rational and internal capacities. And so Aristotle, he has a very strict way of using this expression being potentially such and such. For instance, he would deny that a potato seed, for instance, is potentially mashed potatoes. Why would he deny that? Because in order to make mashed potatoes out of a potato seed, I need to exercise two different active capacities. First, I need to exercise a sort of agricultural active capacity to make potatoes out of a potato seed. And then I need to exercise a different active capacity, a sort of gastronomical capacity, in order to make mashed potatoes out of potatoes. So I could say that a bunch of potatoes are potentially mashed potatoes, but the potato seed is not potentially mashed potatoes. Okay. Aristotle uses that expression, for instance, when he's talking about the matter of a given form phi, understood as the material ingredients for the process directed at the realization of phi. So, for example, the fertilized egg, as opposed to the sperm, is potentially a human being. The sperm is not potentially a human being. The bronze, as opposed to earth, is potentially a statue. Right? So the element earth is not potentially a statue, but bronze is potentially a statue because the bronze requires just the active capacity of the sculpture to be realized in order to be for the process to begin. Right? Okay, this use of the sentence X is potentially F might sound very technical and very exclusive of metaphysics theta, but I don't think that is the case. I think that use of that sentence is present even in ordinary language. Let me give an example. Suppose I am climbing a mountain with a friend. And suppose that my friend is exhausted and willing to give up. And I would like to encourage him. And I say, I can point to the top of the mountain and say, come on, you have the potential to be there. When I say you have the potential to be there, I'm obviously not recognizing my friend the trivial capacity to be at the top of the mountain, just to stand there. The capacity I recognize in him, it cannot be realized, for instance, by a helicopter taking him to the top of the mountain. When I say you have the potential to be there, what I mean is that he has the categorical basis required for undergoing the process of climbing the mountain, right? Just to give an example in ordinary language that matches this use that I'm trying to that I recognize in Aristotle. Okay, this is my crucial move, and now I'm in a position to address the semantic question. So I'd like to begin first by arguing against interpretation B when it comes to the semantic question. So just to remember the semantic question, is change defined as an entelecheia of X dynamis to change into F or X dynamis to be F? I said that when it comes to the grammar of the definition, we should agree with interpretation B and take the expression dynamion as having as a complement a reference to the end state of the change. But now when it comes to the semantic question, I'd like to defend lowercase a as an answer to this question. So I'll take change to be the actuality of something's capacity to change, in spite of what I said about the grammar of the definition. Let me first begin by arguing against option B and interpretation B in regard to the semantic question. So interesting difficulty that is part of this chapter on the physics is what Zuppolini called the product puzzle. The product puzzle is the following one. The definition of change as an actuality of what is potentially such and such seems to pick out the product of change instead of change. So for instance, if I define, if I'm talking about the actuality of the bricks and stones as potentially a house, this expression seems to pick up the house and not the building process. And of course, interpretation A avoids the puzzle at the cost, we must say, at the cost of some circularity, because they avoid the puzzle because they take change to be the actuality of what is potentially changing. So they take the building process of the bricks and stones potentially undergoing the building process. But of course, if you define change as the actuality of a capacity to change, you might be because of providing a circular account of change. And interpretation B boasts to read the definition and solve the product puzzle without any circularity. And according to them, the role of the que clause, of the heto-Hilton clause, is precisely to solve the product puzzle without any circularity. And how they do that? Just to be very brief, the interpretation is very complex and very complicated. I'll give just a brief summary of that. For instance, to use Kasman's expression, the change would be the full manifestation or the constitutive actuality of X potentiality to be F. What does that mean? So the change would be a kind of actuality of X potentiality to be F, but the kind of actuality that preserves the potentiality, or as the actuality as the full displaying or manifestation of a potential. As if when the bricks and stones are just lying there on the floor, it is as if their potential to be a house is some sort inactivated or dormant. And when the building process begins, then the process somehow is the manifestation of that potential. So the process displays, make manifest and evident that the bricks and stones are a house in potentiality. Another way of putting the same point is that the change will be the event by which X's status as a potential F is activated. So the building process is the event by which the bricks and stones potential to be a house becomes sort of activated. And another useful way of putting the same point is by means of an iteration of the adverbs telecheia and dynamic. So during the change, during the process, X is actually potentially F. So the bricks are actually potentially a house. Before the building process, the bricks are only potentially a house. And after the change, the bricks and stones are no longer potentially a house, but actually a house. And now you can see very clearly that interpretation B takes being potentially such and such and being actually such and such as sort of contrary, incompatible predicates. And as I have already pointed out I'm going to reject that premises of their interpretation. Some problems with interpretation B's answer to the semantic question. First one, the unique substitute for heteroton and denomion explicitly considered by Aristotle in the chapter is he kalkos. So Aristotle claims that the sculpting process is the actuality of the bronze, not qua bronze, but qua potentially a statue. So the qua clause is used to distinguish the actuality that the building process is from the actuality that the bricks and stones are. So Aristotle is not using the qua clause to solve the product puzzle. He's not using the heteroton clause to distinguish the product from the process, but in order to distinguish the process as an actuality from the kind of actuality that the matter is, right? So the kind of actuality that the bronze is, or in the case of the sculpting process, or the bricks and stones are in the case of the building process. Okay, another difficulty, I think, is that the qua clause is usually taken to identify between entities that are one in number, the one that is causally relevant in a given context. And by one in number, I mean entities that coincide in the same spatial temporal segment. For instance, when we have the same human being that is both a doctor and a builder, Aristotle takes the builder and the doctor to be accidental compounds that coincide in space and time. And we would like to say that the doctor builds a house qua builder and not qua doctor. And that means that what is causally relevant is that the doctor builds the house by realizing her or his capacity to build, and independently of realizing her or his capacity to heal or to exercise medicine. And the problem is that when in the passage in which Aristotle distinguishes the product from the process and therefore solves the product puzzle, is one in which Aristotle says that the buildable and the house are not one in number. So the two actualities that Aristotle is supposed to distinguish by means of the qua clause are not one in number. So the condition, the very condition for using the qua clause in that way is not satisfied when it comes to distinguishing the product from the process. Another good point against interpretation B when it comes to the semantic question, I think, is a question that Anagnosopoulos raises against it. So think, for instance, about the expression, the actuality of bricks and stones qua potentially a house. That expression gives us the building process as an actuality if we agree with interpretation B. So the actuality of bricks and stones qua potentially a house is the building process and not the house. But then we could ask, the house is the actuality of bricks and stones qua what, if not qua potentially a house? In other words, in the formula that I'm presenting right now to you, what is the value of X that generates the house as a referent for this expression, this formula? I think that this is a good question that is, I think, extremely difficult to answer if you endorse interpretation B. But my main problem with interpretation B is the following one. If interpretation B is correct, does Aristotle succeed in distinguishing change from intermediary stages of change or the product of change? I think the answer is negative, as you can imagine. So let me begin by talking about the intermediary stages of change. It's perfectly plausible, I think, to take a half-built house as a constitutive actuality or full manifestation of the bricks potential to be a house. It's a sort of manifestation of their potential to be a house. You can look at a half-built house and see, well, now I can see that the bricks and stones have the potentiality to be a house. And maybe even the half-built house can be even a better candidate for being the constitutive actuality or full manifestation of the Briggs potential to be a house than the processes, because if you are looking at the process at the early stages of the process, it might not be a good displaying of the Briggs potential to be a house. The half-built house seems to be a more direct and informative way of manifesting, displaying the Briggs potential to be a house. And it's a kind of actual state that preserves the potentiality to be a house, even if you understand potentiality as a contrary of actuality. So if both the half-built house and the process are constitutive actualities of the Briggs potential to be a house, my question is, how do we distinguish one thing from the other from a conceptual point of view? Can we distinguish the process, the building process from the half-built house from the building process without appealing to the concept of change itself? That's my question to anyone who advocates interpretation B. And I think that even the same reasoning apply even to the product of change. Remembering that, as I have said, not all occurrences of X is potentially F denote a capacity incompatible with X being actually F. If so, in this sense, even the house would be a constitutive actuality of the Briggs potentiality to be a house. Why is that so? For a very simple reason, because a house must remain a house. And I think that Aristotle explains the persistence of material objects by making the potentiality to be a house, for instance, compatible with the actuality that the house is. So the bricks remain potentially a house even when they are already a house in actuality. Otherwise, they could not remain the matter of a house, and a house could not remain a house. So the very persistence of material objects depends on that. If this is the case, I'm not saying that this is what Cosman takes constitutive actuality to be, but I'm saying that given the way he defines the constitutive actuality, someone could think that even the house would be a candidate for being the constitutive actuality of the Briggs potentiality to be a house. And if we have those two candidates for being the constitutive actuality, how can we distinguish one thing from the other? Can we distinguish, again, can we distinguish the house and the building process without appealing to the concept of change itself? That's, again, my question to interpretation B. And I think they fail to do that for the reasons I have already presented. So you can see that my main part against interpretation B is that their notion of constitutive actuality is vague enough to include things or actualities that are not changes. And if the notion is vague enough to include actualities that are not changes, my question is, how do you distinguish those different kinds of constitutive actualities from the process that is the main, the actuality that Aristotle is trying to define? Okay, now I have argued against interpretation B. Now some evidence in favor of interpretation B, at least when it comes to the semantic question. All right, some evidence in favor of interpretation A when it comes to the semantic question. So what is interpretation A? Is the claim that change is the actuality of something's capacity to change. The first, important evidence from, at least I think it is important, is the vocabulary Aristotle implies in the chapter. The terms kineton, alloiaton, etc. are more naturally read as changeable, alterable, i.e. as potentially changing, potentially altering, and so on. The best we can do, I think, is in favor of interpretation B would be to take kineton as meaning something like potentially having changed, as Rossi proposes. I'm not sure that this is one of the meanings that the term can have, but even if we accept that move, then circularity is no longer avoided, because if you refer to the end state of the change as a state of having changed, then you are characterizing the end state in terms of the change itself. So the main advantage of interpretation B against interpretation A, also they boast, is precisely avoiding circularity. And if we consider Aristotle uses the way Aristotle employs his vocabulary throughout the physics, we get the same impression. For instance, in the first chapter of book 8, Aristotle argues that from the account of change as the activity of the changeable qua changeable, it follows that there must be things capable of changing in conformity with each kind of change. And in the Greek, he uses kineista as a component of phenomena. And here, clearly, he's talking about the capacity to change. And he's not referring to the capacity to be in the end state of the change. Another important evidence in favor of A, I think, is the conclusion of Aristotle's discussion of change in the third book of the Physics. Aristotle's final and gnoimoteron, the better known account of change that he formulates, is that is change as the actuality of what is potentially acting and what is potentially acted on, qua acting and qua acted on. So he has included now a reference to an active capacity and a passive capacity, and he's characterizing changing as the joint realization of active capacity and a passive capacity. And he's not referring to the end state of the agent and the end state of the patient in order to define the change. He's talking about the exercise of the relevant active and passive capacities to promote, to produce the process in the case of the agent and suffer the process in the case of the patient. All right. What I think is the advantage that the main advantage that distinguishes the interpretation that I am proposing now, which is a combination of B when it comes to the grammar question and A when it comes to the meaning of the definition, is that Aristotle uses kineton on the one hand and dynameion and dynaton on the other interchangeably. And this procedure makes perfect sense if X is potentially F, means X is capable of changing into F. Because the only promising truth maker of the sentence, bricks and stones are potentially a house, in 3.1, is the fact that bricks and stones exemplify the categorical basis for undergoing the building process. For only in this sense, first, the bricks and stones are potentially a house is equivalent to bricks and stones are buildable. So being potentially a house is the same as being buildable. And also only in this sense, the buildable denotes an entity that no longer exists when the house comes into existence. So the potential house no longer exists when the house is actual, only if the potential house means or refers to something that has the categorical basis for undergoing the process. And when the matter is in the state of being a house in actuality, the bricks and stones no longer present the categorical basis for undergoing the building process. Now they present the categorical basis for being the functional matter of the house, for fully instantiating the form of the house. Let's compare that result with the other alternative that we have for a truth maker of that sentence. The capacity to fully instantiate the form of the house and its corresponding categorical basis, which is functional matter, first can hardly be described as buildability. So the state of the house, when the state of the house of the matter, of the functional matter of the house can hardly be described in terms of buildability. In fact, the matter is not buildable when you're talking about functional matter. And second, this capacity not only can coexist with the house, but necessarily does so. So in 201b5-15, no longer get that the potential house no longer exists when the house is already there, because the potential house in this second sense means refers to the capacity to fully instantiate the form of the house, and that capacity is present in the bricks and stones when they are actually a house. Okay. I think this interpretation of the chapter also gives us a good summary of the chapter. Why is that? Because Aristotle begins with by presenting his agenda in Physics books 3 and 4. Then he makes some preliminary remarks about potentiality, actuality, and the doctrine of categories. Then Aristotle finally presents his account of change. And after a parenthetical remark, he makes a first distinction. He distinguishing building building as the actuality of bricks, qua potentially a house, versus the actuality of bricks, qua bricks. So in this first distinction, Aristotle is employing the heteroeuton clause to distinguish the actuality that the building process is from the actuality that bricks and stones are. But if this expression, being potentially a house, is an ambiguous expression, then it could also, we need to disambiguate that expression. And Aristotle needs a second distinction. And in this second distinction, what Aristotle is doing is disambiguating the expression bricks and stones qua potentially a house. We have two senses. These two senses refer to two different capacities that correspond to two different actualities. And therefore, he needs to distinguish those two actualities, the house and the building process, and corresponding the capacity to be a house, the capacity to undergo the building process. Okay. Now, I would like to end my presentation by addressing, of course, what probably most of you have in mind. I know that interpretation B is very popular among scholars, and perhaps most of you are thinking, well, what about the problem of circularity? Then I'll try to answer what the so-called circularity charge right now. So let us think a little bit about the structure of the objection. So the objection goes as follows. So first, Aristotle intends to formulate a reductive account of change, i.e., a set of individually necessary and collectively sufficient conditions for change that can all be grasped independently of the concept of change. That's what it means to give an analysis, a reductive analysis of change. Therefore, it follows that charity requires us to read Aristotle as formulating a non-circular account of change. Therefore, we should prefer interpretation B in detriment of interpretation A. Okay. The problem, I think, is that there is no textual evidence in favor of one. Even if I know Aristotle uses the expression horismos, but horismos doesn't mean necessarily analysis. And I think quite on the contrary, I think that we have plenty textual evidence to deny the premise of the objection, which is by statement number 1 here. First, we have the beginning of the chapter. Aristotle remembers us that there is no generic end state of actuality over and above the categories. Being is not a kind. And as a result, since any change is restricted to a given specific category, change, generally speaking, is not a genuine, unified kind that can be defined univocally without appealing to one specific category or another. That's what I think Aristotle is doing, is claiming in this passage. And that's why he can conclude that there are as many summa genera of changes as there are categories, as there are summa genera of beings. Since there is not an actuality over and above the categories, there's not a kind of change over and above the specific kinds of change: generation, alteration, locomotion, and so on and so forth. So there's not a kind of change over and above the specific kinds of change in the same way as there is, for instance, the genus animal over and above the several species of animal. So in the same way as in terms of giving an account of being, the best we can do is to characterize being as either substance or quality or place, etc. The same applies to change. The best we can do about change is to characterize it as either generation or alteration or locomotion, and so on. A good analogy, I think, is Timothy Williamson's knowledge first epistemology. So Williamson argues that we should not look for a reductive analysis of knowledge, and knowledge is thus just the most general effective mental state. So the best account of knowing that P that we can have is to say that knowing that P is either perceiving that P or remembering that P, etc. And in fact, in theta, in Aristotle's most systematic treatment of potentiality actuality, capacity to change and change is the paradigmatic case of potentiality actuality, based on which other cases are elucidated and general notions of potentiality and actuality are conceived by induction and analogy. So how weird would it be if Aristotle now in the physics is trying to elucidate or analyze change and capacity to change in terms of some more basic cases of potentiality and actuality. And this abstract notion of potentiality, actuality, that Aristotle derives in theta is an abstraction from more concrete, intuitive cases. Among those cases is the capacity to change and change. So to sum up, I have three questions for those who advocate for interpretation B. The first question is, what is Aristotle's analysis of change after all? What are the individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for change? Question number two, are these conditions independent of the concept of change? And finally, are these conditions satisfied by all and only changes and not by intermediary stages or other actualities? I think that my personal impression is that no one who takes Aristotle in the literature, at least, anyone who takes Aristotle to aim at a reductive analysis of change in physics 3 give satisfying answers to those three questions. So my demand for anyone who wants to defend interpretation B is to give satisfying replies to those three questions, and I have tried to argue that the answer that they come up with are not satisfying answers. If we don't have good answers for these three questions, then we can use the principle of charity against interpretation B. We could argue that if Aristotle intends to give a reductive analysis of change, then he fails miserably. And therefore, charity requires us to read Aristotle as not intending to formulate a reductive, non-circular account of change. The charitable reading is not taking Aristotle to aim at an analysis of change. So just to finish, you might think, if not analysis, then what Aristotle is doing? And I think this is the kind of question that we contemporary readers can make because we are obsessed with conceptual analysis. And my invitation is that we should try to avoid being obsessed with conceptual analysis, especially in terms of fundamental concepts such as the concept of change. And I think that Aristotle accomplishes a lot. Even though he doesn't provide an analysis of change, he accomplishes a lot. See, he sets up a model for reflective understanding of change, which involves taking each kind of change as occurring within a given ontological category, for instance, as not being its own telos or goal, but as governed by an end state extrinsic to the change itself, as being the actuality or realization of a specific disposition with its characteristic categorical basis, as also the joint realization of a passive capacity and an active capacity. And finally, perhaps against some eleatic opponents, as something real, as a particular kind of actuality with its own distinctive features. That will be all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Breno, for your presentation. I'm opening us now for questions. I'll start with the professors who are here in order to debate the presentation, and then I will move on to the questions that are asked in the chat. I see that we have already one question, but only the one. So I will ask our debaters here to talk in turn, remembering that each one should open and close his mic to avoid any form of echo. Who would like to start? Lucas, please.
Hi, Breno. My question is related to something you have expounded, but maybe I lost something because of internet connection, and just sorry if I missed something. But it was not so clear from me, especially from your drive to differentiate change and what you have called at some point intermediate states or something like that. It was not clear to me whether you were taking change to involve success in the realization. So that the idea is just if I'm right now drawing a circle in a paper, this is a classical example from the 50s, more than 50 years ago, by a paper. I forgot the name of the writer, but if I'm drawing a circle right now in a paper, but I stop in the middle and I don't finish the drawing, I don't have a circle in the paper, but I was drawing a circle, and is it still true to say that I was drawing a circle and at that moment? So that suggests that well, if this is the Aristotle's view about kinesis, that implies a picture in which, in order to be in movement, or in order for a subject to have movement at a given time, it's not necessary for it to continue that process until full success or full realization of the end, etc., etc. Well, that's my question. Sorry if you have addressed this at some point, but I have lost if you have.
No, I haven't, and I agree with everything you just said. I don't think that a process Aristotle described this change as being sort of incomplete, interrupted, and so on. So I don't think that we have change only when the change is completed or succeeds, so to speak. My point was that, and I think that this actually favors my view, because takes, for instance, a building process that is interrupted at a very early stage, right? We still have a process. It's an unfinished process, but it is a process for Aristotle. And compare it with a half-built house. So the state of bricks and stones that are formed like a half-built house, but are not undergoing the building process. Which of these two candidates, the interrupted process and the half-built house, is the full manifestation or a better manifestation or displaying of the brick's potentiality to be a house? I think that the half-built house is a better candidate for being the sort of constitutive actuality of the brick's potential to be a house than the building process at the very early stage. But like, for instance, Cosman is obliged to say that, well, in one case we have the process, and the other we don't have the process, and just the process is the full manifestation of the brick's potential to be a house. So, so my point is precisely that I think that a half-built house can be taken as a constitutive actuality of the brick's potential to be a house. And even if Cosman is not thinking about that, when obviously he's not thinking about the half-built house when he's proposing his notion of, advancing his notion of constitutive actuality. But if the way he describes constitutive actuality is compatible with, or applies to half-built house, then my question for Cosman would be, how can you distinguish one constitutive actuality or one candidate for constitutive actuality from the other? What is special about the building process that the half-built house fails to present? And my question is, can you distinguish both things without appealing to the concept of change itself? So the rule that they need to follow, that anyone who defends interpretation B needs to follow, is never appealing to the concept of change in order to explain what change is for Aristotle. And I think that the notion of constitutive actuality is vague enough to include intermediary stages of the process. And therefore, we have this question: what is the difference between one thing and the other? I'm not sure if so I would agree with everything you've just said. And I think that my point against interpretation B is not committed to the view that processes are necessarily complete or that they necessarily succeed for Aristotle.
Okay, thank you, Breno. I have another remark, but it is very, very sketchy. And maybe can I go ahead?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, it's very theological and more related to my present worries as a reader of Aristotle. So I'm interested in general in Aristotle's language and Aristotle's style of writing, and I think that many times Aristotle is struggling with expressions, and he's trying to give expression of what is the point he is making, etc. And then, well, arriving precisely at the point I'm interested in now is this. So many times the genitives in Aristotle's texts are very messy. It's very complicated. And sometimes, well, putting this question in the framework of your definition, we have this entelecheia as the central notion, so to speak, to define kinesis, but then we need to specify more. Entelecheia of what? But then entelecheia of what is tricky, because it might be a question about the, let's say, raw subject or basic built subject on which the process we are trying to define is located. But the genitive might also be identifying exactly what is the entelecheia about, what is the kinesis, the entelecheia we are trying to define is about, or what it involves. In other words, is what I'm trying to say is this: if kinesis is an entelecheia to start with, now we have to specify where it is exactly located. Then we have answers like bricks and stones, blah, blah, etc. But we might also ask and express this in Greek with a genitive. We might also say that the entelecheia we are trying to specify at that point is an entelecheia which involves a process towards being a house as the, let's just say, the product. And both things are codified or expressed by genitives in Aristotle's. In general, I'm in this sort of situation. And it seems to me that in line 201a 1011, Aristotle is kind of struggling with this in his mind, because we have this to dyname ontos, and I think this is in line with your view. So to dyname ontos seems to be looking for a kind of brute subject on which the entelecheia is located. So the question would be, well, is the thing like bricks and stones that have the potentiality to be a house? But then when he says heterouton, he is not commenting on to dyname on as such, but he is, as such, I mean, as able to be a house, for instance, but he seems to be commenting on Toyuton as something which is implied, and he has not yet said. See what we have in the continuation of the text. Hoyan to men aloia tu, he aloiaton. So what I'm suggesting is that when he says tu aloia tu and tu auxia tu, etc., tu genetu kaifter tu, etc., he has in mind an intentionally different object, intentionally different from what he has said in genome ontos. So in order to pack this together, the definition would be a kind of very, very disorganized packing together of two different ideas. So the kinesis de enteleke of two denominations, namely bricks as capable of being a house, but then Aristotle has something more in mind, and he adds this Toyuton, but this Toyuton is meant to pick up exactly what the intellectia involves, which is the capacity to become a house. I don't know if this is clear enough, but the text is messy, but the expression in Aristotle's Greek is messy. But I think that there is some principle way of reasoning behind the text in Aristotle's mind, probably, which we can track in a better way if we make this sort of elucubration I just suggested. But I think this is absolutely in line with what you are trying to express with this B. I think it's B. Not lowercase, the other one. Well, BA. Yeah, the BA reading you propose. Well, this is the question. Sorry, it's very complicated and convoluted, but okay.
So, are you suggesting? Let's see if I understood your point. So, Toyuton is not necessarily referring back to dyname on in an intentional level. It's just like referring to the subject of the process as, for instance, we would translate as Toyuton as like such and such, as like a sign, empty sign that should be like replaced by what appears in the following lines, like kineton, aloiaton and geneton and so on. And so it will be like I considered that reading, and in my mind I phrase it as if the Toyuton was sort of cataphoric, as referring to the kineton, aloiaton, geneton, and so on in the following lines. I figure Aristotle will use again dyname and had dyname in other versions of the definition. In the first chapter, including in the first chapter. And although that might be an option, I came to the conclusion that this move is not necessary, because I started thinking, well, the whole debate is concerns the distinction between a capacity to change and a capacity to be. And I start thinking, what is a capacity to be? When people are talking about capacity to be, what do they mean? So what is the disposition that they are referring to? What is the categorical basis for that disposition, and so on? I started to try to specify what that means. And I came to the conclusion that different capacities can be referred to by this expression being in potentiality. And being in potentiality in a given end state. So when I say, I think when we're thinking metaphysical theta, this is precisely the criteria, or the criterion he gives for using correctly the expression being potentially something such and such. And he says, well, one of the uses of the term, the use he has in mind in theta is having the capacity to change. And if we think how this expression is used in ordinary language, we use that expression in the same sense as well. If this is the case, and I think I came to the conclusion that this is the only, if there is if dynamion is just not a way of expressing a model claim, but if is a way of attributing a capacity, which I think is the case when it comes to Aristotle. Then if we make the question, what is the capacity Aristotle is referring to in the definition? There is no plausible answer to that, I think, except for the capacity to change. And if this is so, we can take Toyuton as referring back to dynamion, no problem at all. Because to be potentially a statue in this context means precisely to be capable of undergoing the sculpting process. Cosman would say, for instance, no, is the capacity to be. My question to Cosman and Ursula Koop and other interpreters is, what do you mean by capacity to be? Is like a model claim. There is a possible world in the future in which the bronze is a statue, is something like that. It would be a little bit anachronistic. Or do you mean something like to be potentially a statue is to fully instantiate the form of the statue? This cannot be the case because this is not the sense of the expression that is relevant for the chapter. And I think that the concrete capacity that the bronze presents, and that is the truth maker of the sentence, the bronze is potentially a statue, is the capacity to undergo the sculpting process. So, although I think this is possible as a reading of the text, I don't think it's necessary because there's not an opposition between capacity to be and capacity to change if capacity to be is understood in this sense, which is one of the senses in which one of the senses that Aristotle recognized. But thank you anyway. I think it was one of the options that I have considered, and but I don't see any problem in taking Toyuton as referring back to dynamion. You see my point, right? So I take kineton and dynamion. So to be kineton and to be like dynamion are these are equivalent expressions in Aristotle, in my view. Even if dynamion has as a complement not kineton, but the end state of the change. I think that's the crucial point here.
Lucas, are you satisfied? Yes? So now it's Rodrigo's turn. Rodrigo, please.
Hi everybody. Thank you, Daniel, for inviting me. Thank you, Breno, for the discussion. Well, as expected, I have just very general remarks to do. And I will just tell a little bit how I see your text. I see your text. You are dealing with two different topics, and in the main part of the text, you are talking about Aristotle. Okay, and the second part, in the second part of the paper, in fact, we're not talking about Aristotle. We're just talking about how to read Aristotle, and this is, you have this two moments, which is very interesting, I think. And so my remarks will also be on one side and then on the other side. Regarding the part specifically about Aristotle, I read your presentation as an extremely insightful presentation of the idea of the priority of acts in relation to potency in Aristotle. Okay, and as you say, this idea that the bronze, the actual bronze, is the truth maker of the statement, which says the bronze is potentially a statue. It's very, very clear, And I think it's really a very good way to present this idea, which is not that obvious. This idea of the potentiality of the act. And so I will begin from this point, but my first remark will be a little bit tricky. I agree with you, and I agree with this idea of the priority of the act of Aristotle, and I'm happy to have heard you, because I think now I've understand it a little bit better than I had before. But I just want to, that would be the natural question, I think, from the other guy in the dialogue. You say, I don't have the numbers of the slides here, but it's the slide, the semantic question. It's the slide that you come from the idea. I'll read just the expression that interests me. X is only potentially F. Nah? And and now I think the guy who is against us, because I'm with you in this boat, but the guy who is against us is saying, oh, now I have my point. Look, you have been trying to put the actuality in front of potentiality, and you say X will be recognized as potentially Y after, let's say, just chronological, but perhaps we don't need to think about that, okay? Be caritative with this part. After there have been some action, some active subject has produced some action upon this guy, and then I can, in the second moment, recognize it as potentially Y. Just like you said, the bronze is the truth maker of the bronze's potential in the state. But now you have a second point that say, okay, but if I push it a little further, then I will need to have a second potentially, which seems now to be before the act. But you could say, of course, no, this one will be also the result of another act, but then you go in infinite. And my question is, how would you reply to that? I'm just going to stress, I'm not defending this point, but I see it as a very good objection against our position, that in this point I'm with you. That is, no, I don't, perhaps you say, I would say, you know, I don't know exactly what Aristotle has in mind, but it's not that what he's thinking, because he's thinking about a kind of priority of the act in relation to the person across the board, from the beginning to the end. It's not a question that this priority will emerge at some point of the process. This is a norm, a rule that is governing the whole picture. That would be my first point. My second point would be just, this is more remark, more critical. I had the impression you want to say that in a house, the brick loses its capacity, potentiality to be a house. No? I think you phrase somehow like that.
It's the opposite. It doesn't. The opposite.
It will make clear for you. My question is just, I will have the tendency to say this occurs only with living things, not with artifacts in a strict sense, not with houses, not with tables. But of course, my heart it loses a little bit. It's to be hard. It will be governed not anymore by being a heart, but by being a human being. But my question is, do you agree with that? And you are using the example of the brick just for the sake of the argument, just because of that, or you really think that also in artifacts the parts lose their identity as parts, nevertheless, not as parts, as unities per se, somehow per se. No, in artifacts we can really say that it's per se, because the leg of the table is per se wood, I would say. And this is the priority of the facts. The bricks. And another thing is, well, it's very important for you that you have you must have this kind of possibility of, at the same moment, at the same instance, you have the potentiality and the actuality for the same thing, just like you said, with the very clear idea of walking. When I'm walking, I keep my potentiality of walking. Two remarks on that. First is, okay, walking I understand, but walking is an action, okay? And it might be the case, I think it would be healthy to think there are some distinctions here when we're talking about actions, because the actuality of walking is already a change, no? And we're talking about things, and then but when we are talking about things, I would agree with you. We keep the two meanings. We're not talking not about walking, but about houses. But I would say that in this case, the notion of potentiality in this case would be, perhaps I'm wrong, but I would dare to say, at least for beginning with, in order to begin with, it's only a logical one. It's just because you have the rule that esse ad posse valet consequentia, and then you have really this logical meaning of posse, and so it would not fit with your picture, which requires the potency to be more than just the truth of a model statements in the future. Okay, and I agree with you with that. That would be my third point. And about the second part, the about reading Aristotle, that was really very interesting, because it's the first time I think I can say that with some being sure. It's the first time I hear you talking about physics. It was always about psychoanalytics, in general theory of science, and I was expecting to have something, to have another reaction to this, and I don't. It's the same question about fundamentalalism, and and I have the same feeling. You keep trying to find in Aristotle a kind of relative fundamentalism, which is just an oxymoron. Yeah? And that's very interesting, because it's another point, but it's more or less the same question there, because this idea that, well, when Aristotle's fail, we should, I'm phrasing just in a character way, of course. Where Aristotle's fail, we should give up trying to see where and how he could possibly do it. He could possibly have done it. It seems that this is your attitude. And then you say, well, no, we just, it fails because it's circular, point. And you say, no, but okay, but we can keep staying at this step back, this step before that happened, and then you justify it from the point of view of charity, which, well, okay, it's complicated, because of that. In this dialogue, you are just throwing the pineapple from one hand to another, from one hand to another. But what I think is this: it seems that in this case, the physics would not be a book, would be just a kind of Aufsatzsammlung, a kind of collection of essays or something like that. You're losing the unity of physics. You're losing and you're saying, yeah, that's all right, okay, no problem. And that's the point we'll probably die fighting each other. And I think you can possibly say from another perspective, okay, I agree with you that there is no genes of the physics, okay, But why not, for instance, trying to see how Aristotle can nevertheless build a unified science, using other tools, of course, other kinds of unities. He needs to think about other criteria of unity, perhaps. This is just a project. Why it is not more interesting as a way of reading Aristotle than saying, as I'm exaggerating, of course, but because I know I can say this kind of thing to you, you won't be a fan. But instead of saying no, just let's give up the unity of sciences. Just a matter of a myriad of regional investigations which have families resemblance. You can even use something fancy just like Wittgenstein, but this doesn't explain anything. No? My question is this: why this kind of approach to Aristotle's trying not to think about Aristotelian ways of solving problems which Aristotle didn't solve in an explicit way, or even worse, problems which Aristotle failed to solve in an explicit way? I think it's more a general question about philosophy, history of philosophy. Feel comfortable to answer it. Just like it. Thank you, Brandon. That's really nice.
I ask for your presence, Rodrigo, because I think your kind of provocative way of debating is very stimulating, and I appreciate the questions. Several questions actually, and I try to be brief. You were talking about the iteration of the adverbs, talking about being potential, the bricks being potentially a house when they are just lying there on the floor, etc. Right? So I don't think I need, or my interpretation, it's an interesting question, but I don't think my interpretation needs to give a reply to that question, because I'm not using that kind of resource to read the chapter. It is interpretation B that actually is doing something like that. So for interpretation B, the bricks and stones, when they are just lying on the floor, they are just potentially a house. So the building process is the event by which somehow this status as a potential house is some sort of activated, and the bricks becomes actually potentially a house during the process. And I would say that, okay, that makes sense. Is an interesting. I grant that the notion of constitutive actuality is an interesting notion, and the iteration of these adverbs potentially actually is also interesting. Gives us something to think about, but I don't think it solves the problem that it is meant to solve, which is to solve what the product puzzle without any circularity. And I have tried to show that it doesn't solve. There might be, and I think there are several questions that can be made about this sort of iteration of potentiality and actuality, such as the one that you have raised. I don't have a good answer to that question. And I'm not sure if this is a useful tool. It's an interesting way of putting the question, but I don't think we needed to read the text. And I have tried to read the text without appealing to that kind of thing. About the bricks losing the potentiality to be a house, I'm not sure if I followed the second question, but my point was precisely the opposite, precisely that the bricks preserve their potentiality to be a house when they are a house in actuality. And it is precisely that preservation that explains the persistence of the house. The house is able to remain a house because the bricks and stones potentiality to be a house is preserved when the bricks are a house in actuality. So I'm not sure if I follow your second question, but I think that the interpretation B is committed to the view that being potentially a house and being actually a house are sort of opposite, are contrary features. And I was saying that if we are talking about capacity to be in my first sense, so the capacity to fully instantiate the form of something, not only they are compatible, but they coexist. And what is capable of being a house in the sense of fully instantiating the form of the house are the bricks and stones when they are actually a house. When I'm talking about the bricks and stones as a potentially a house in the other sense, they are not actually a house. And that means that they are a potential house in the sense they are capable of undergoing the building process, right? Okay.
No, the second question, so it seems it was just misunderstanding, sorry.
Okay, good. Wonderful. And the activity, it's just, we would have to bring metaphysics theta to the debate and argue about how the test is working. But I think that when I was talking about walking as an activity, I was precisely thinking about the distinction between activities and changes in theta. And activity is a complete actuality, whereas kinesis is an incomplete actuality, and whereas when kinesis is not, when a kinesis is complete, it is the potentiality to undergo the process is not there anymore, so it doesn't preserve the relevant potentiality, whereas the activity preserves the corresponding capacity. So for Aristotle, when I'm walking, I preserve my capacity to walk. And I was just mentioning activities just to make the point that some potentialities are compatible with the corresponding actualities. And I was saying that to argue against interpretation B, that the bricks and stones remain a house in potentiality when they are actually a house. And therefore, even the house could be a constitutive actuality of the bricks potential to be a house. So we again have it's a sort of a new version of the product puzzle. So they solve a sort of a version of the product puzzle by creating another puzzle. And the new question is, if the house can be also a constitutive actuality of the bricks potential to be a house, you, Cosman and Ursula Koop and so on, you have to, Sarah Brody, you have to explain the difference between the product as a candidate for constitutive actuality and the process as a constitutive actuality. Of course, they are not thinking that the house is a constitutive actuality. Of course not. But my question is, what is the difference? Once we put in the table that the bricks and stones remain a housing potentiality, and of course, you can, when you can see that the bricks can be a house, better. When you see the house already built, or when you like testify the building process as a whole. So that was what I was thinking about. And very briefly about the thing about how to read Aristotle and so on. I don't think anything that I have said implies something about the unity of the science, physics as a science. All that I was trying to say is that change can be a fundamental concept within that framework. Of course, if you are engaged in conceptual analysis, unless you are okay with infinite regress, there must be concepts that are fundamental. They are not susceptible to conceptual analysis. And I think that we don't have good textual evidence pointing to the fact that Aristotle thinks that change is a kind of thing that can be analyzed in terms of more basic notions. In fact, my point is the following, it's very basic. I think that change is a very basic fundamental notion in perhaps any conceptual framework. And therefore, I think that the attempt to give an analysis of change in terms of more basic notions is a bold project. That could be Aristotle's intent, but I don't see any textual evidence that this is the case. So
just a small remark, just in order to understand. But if it's, because I think you're trying to say there is a kind of primary diversity of models or kinds of change. Just like, I think you even drew the analogy between the categories and change. And now you're saying, you seems to say, point towards a fundamental concept of change. It's this relation I think I'm not understanding quite well, because either you're talking about, well, there are, let us say, 10 different meanings of change according to each category, and there is no unity, or there is one fundamental, not meaning, but well, one fundamental meaning which can be fundamental up to the point that it can be undefinable, because you won't have nothing, you won't have anything about it. But
these are two different things. One thing is to say that there is several meanings of change, and one of the meanings is fundamental. I was not saying that. I'm not sure if there are many meanings of change. I was just committed to the view that there is not a univocal definition of change. Change could be something, a univocal concept without an analysis being available. Such as knowledge is a univocal concept in Timothy Williamson's knowledge first epistemology, but there is not an analysis for knowledge. And my point is that it is fundamental in the sense that I use change to explain other concepts. For instance, the concept of nature is defined in terms of change. But I'm not sure that the definition of change is an analysis, is a reductive analysis, a definition that employs concepts that can be understood independently of the very concept of change. And I think that the concept of change is very difficult to provide an analysis for such a concept. And I cannot see an analysis in the interpreters that provide an analysis, that think that Aristotle provides an analysis for change. So I have tried to argue that Cosman and Ursula Koop and Sarah Brody, I think they fail to say very clearly what is Aristotle's analysis of change. What are the individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for change in Aristotle? Because if they were able to present such a set of conditions, I could ask, well, are these conditions independent of the concept of change or not? And I think I'm not like throwing the pineapple back to them just because this is the kind of dialectical game. I think the burden of the proof is on them. They are saying that Aristotle is trying to provide an analysis. My question to them is, what is the analysis after all? And prove to me that the analysis is not circular after all. And I have tried to say that the notion of constitutive actuality is vague enough to include things that are not changes. If other things besides change can be taken as a sort of constitutive actuality, I can ask them what are the conditions for distinguishing one kind of constitutive actuality from the one that you think is relevant for the debate, which is change. Can you do it without appealing to the concept of change itself? No. That's my question to them.
Okay, yeah. I think it's clear now many of the difference, and I will leave you with one idea, and I think you don't agree with this idea, but I think it's interesting for you to have it in mind as an hypothesis to fight against. I would say, well, there is a problem there, because either it's the concept, it's any concept, first or non-univocal. If it's first, it is univocal. If it's non-univocal, it's not first, and that's logic. You're probably not agreeing with that, but I just wanted to we should to have it in mind while thinking about and to fight against this position, for instance, in order to live. I think that would make things clear.
I agree. I think I agree. And having said that, perhaps I need to think more about that in the following sense. Before I say that change is conceptually fundamental, perhaps I must make my mind about whether change is like a case of homonymy, like being a pros-hand homonymy or other kind of homonymy, or whether it's something like more like Timothy Williamson's concept of knowledge. Because it is, I insist on that point. One thing it is two different things here. One is to be a univocal concept, one single genuine concept. Another thing is something to be analyzable and definable and so on. But I have to.
And what I'm saying, that's every unanalyzable concept is univocal.
Yes, if we are talking about one single concept, then I think we have to consider some univocity to it. I think this last point is really useful. Thank you. Perhaps I'll have to modulate a little bit when I bring this issue about univocity in arguing against interpretation B. This is useful. Thank you, Rodrigo.
I'm very happy to have helped. Thank you.
So now we have a question by Roberto Grasso. Before we start with the questions from the audience, Roberto, please.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Breno. Now I'm back thinking about the definition of change, and I face the same confusion, mental confusion that I was facing when I was trying to understand it. So I think my question is more like an attempt to understand what you want to say. So I will just use this time for personal purposes, but I hope it's useful. So from what I was understanding when I was studying these chapters, the debate is more or less like this. Some people think that Aristotle cannot give a circular analysis, so it's not, the definition is not in terms of a specific potentiality for change, it will be circular, it's a potentiality for being. Okay, so there is no circularity, but you cannot say stuff like something can be potentially F and actually F at the same time. Then there are the other guys, and they say, no matter what you think about definitions, analysis, and circularity, Aristotle is hinting at a special potentiality for change, and therefore we have a potentiality for being and a specific potentiality for change. And then you have perhaps no hope of having an analysis with no circularity, but you can say stuff like something can be F actually and potentially F at the same time, right? If this is what I'm getting. Now, my question is, which one of the two resembles your approach? And more specifically, do you believe that in Aristotle in general, not maybe in this passage where he defines kinesis, there is a distinction between a potentiality for change and a potentiality for being? Or you want to throw out one of the two? Which one? So from some things that you were saying, I had the impression that you want to eliminate this talk about the potentiality for being, but I'm not sure. So this is why I'm asking you this question.
I think that in the way you framed your question, it sounds as if you were more concerned with the semantic question. So not about just the grammar of the definition. So my interpretation is a little bit hybrid because I when it comes to analyzing the grammar of the definition, I agree with interpretation B, with Ursula Koop, Sarah Brody, Cosman, etc. So Aristotle is describing the building process as the actuality of the bricks and stones qua potentially house, right? This is the grammar of the definition. Right? But my point is that saying that the bricks and stones are potentially a house is a sentence that is a proposition whose truth maker is precisely the bricks and stones' capacity to undergo the process. So I'm not trying to get rid of the distinction between capacity to change and capacity to be. Rather, my question is, my point is that there is no such thing as a generic capacity to be. So my point is just, I have a question for anyone that explores the distinction. The question is, what do you mean by capacity to be? Right? And I'm saying that one of the possible candidates for this is precisely coincidental with capacity to change. And Aristotle uses the formula X is potentially F. Sometimes he's referring to X's capacity to change into F. Okay, what are the other candidates for what are the other capacities that can be the possible truth makers of that kind of sentence? That's my question. Another candidate, the only candidate I can think of is being capable of fully instantiating, having the material constitution to fully instantiate Fness. So this applies to functional matter. Basically. So my question is, if there is a consensus that X is potentially F, it attributes a capacity to, a disposition to X. My question is simply, what is the capacity in each context? And my point is that in some contexts, for instance, metaphysics theta, and here in physics 3, that sentence scheme, X is potentially F, is about X's capacity to change into F. That's my point. That's what allows me to side with interpretation B when it comes to the grammar of the definition, and with interpretation A when it comes to what the definition means. What is the capacity that is being realized in any change?
So it would be correct to say that if we limit ourselves to this context, namely physics 3 and metaphysics theta, it looks like there is just the potentiality for change. No matter how we formulate it, we can formulate it as the potentiality for being the building, okay, or the potentiality to change. But as a matter of fact, we are talking about the same thing in this context, okay? Yeah. Now, sorry if I'm using the space to understand Aristotle using Breno, but so when the other guys are talking about the potentiality for change as opposed to the potentiality for being, or at least my impression was that they are thinking about something like, okay, suppose that you are considering a house, okay, and you are talking about a house that has been a house for a while, and you ask, okay, this thing now is a house. Was it potentially a house in the past, okay, when it was already a house? So the potentiality for being would be the potentiality for, let's say, the power or potentiality for that something that is F has to keep being F.
Yes.
Okay.
But that cannot be, I don't think that this is what the interpreters think when they are talking about capacity to be in this chapter, because that cannot be the case. Because the capacity that the bricks and stones present during the change or before the change begins is not a capacity to persist as a house, is the capacity to undergo the process. So The trick is the following. Since Aristotle does that, since Aristotle associates capacities with categorical bases, if you want to individuate a capacity, ask for the corresponding categorical bases. So what are the material properties that make the bricks and stones potentially a house when they are not yet a house? Those material properties are the same that realizes or on which capacity to change supervene. So perhaps there is a difference in intentionality, right, between capacity to be and capacity to be in this sense and capacity to change in that sense. But that's no problem to me if there is a difference in intentionality. If Aristotle is not trying to give an intentional equivalence, and there is no intentional equivalence in real definitions, I think. So there is nothing wrong about those propositions being, there being a different intentionality. But they are describing the same capacity. When I say about the bricks and stones that are not yet a house, that they are potentially a house, the kind of capacity that I'm recognizing in them is the capacity to change into a house. Okay. I'm talking about the same capacity. I can refer to the same capacity as a capacity to change or as a capacity to be. But the disposition that is present there in the bricks and stones, when they are not yet, when they are ready to undergo the building process, but they are not yet a house, is the same capacity. That's my point. So I don't.
You say that in some cases this potentiality is not lost at the end of the change. Now my question is, are there cases where it is lost, or as they say, exhausted at the end of the change? And how does it work when, if there are these cases, how does it work?
The potentiality that I have just mentioned is exhausted at the end of the change. But there is a different possible, there is a different capacity that can also be described as a capacity to be. This is the other candidate for being potentially a house. It's a different capacity.
Okay, so there are two. Okay, there are two
capacities. So there are two kinds of sort of capacity to be. One is equivalent to capacity to change, and the other one is having the material constitution to fully instantiate a given form. This second kind of capacity to be is presented by, for instance, functional matter. Functional matter is a housing potentiality in this sense, because the categorical bases are now, the categorical basis is now different. The bricks and stones are in a different material state.
Okay. There are two capacities, but both can be described either as capacities for change or capacities.
No, the second one is not equivalent to capacity to change. Just the first one, because the bricks and stones, when they are already a house, they are no longer buildable. Aristotle says that.
Mm-hmm.
The bricks and stones are no longer buildable. That means that they are not capable of undergoing the building process anymore. They remain a housing potentiality in a different way, not because they are capable of changing into a house, but because they realize the form of the house completely, and they remain capable of realizing that in the future. So that's why the fact that the functional matter preserves the potentiality, the functional matter of the house preserves the potentiality to be a house, is the very explanation of the persistence of the house through time. So it's a little bit tricky, the vocabulary, but what I have tried to do is precisely to distinguish two different capacities that can be signified by the very same sentence scheme. X is potentially F. It could refer either to a capacity to be in the sense of being capable of changing into that end state, and it can refer to a capacity to be in the sense of fully instantiating the relevant actuality.
Okay. I see. So it would be fair to say that you side with the second guys I was describing, but with the important exception that you think that the grammar of that, let's call it definition, but not in the sense, is the grammar that the other guys are.
Precisely, yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Well, so since the first round of questions has ended, now it's time for the questions from the audience. The first question is by Mario Sergio Jr. It's a question he posted a while ago. I asked him if he wanted to elaborate a bit, but he didn't answer, so I'll post it as is. He asks the following: how is the intellect dynamic in change since it assumes its identity?
I don't understand the question. So
yes.
if Mario could reformulate, I would be grateful. I really perhaps is talking about nose in the animal or something like that. I have no idea. Even if I don't know what the question is, I'm almost sure that I won't be able to answer if I understood it. So I'm really sorry.
Let's hope Mario can actually elaborate on that question. And now we have an observation by Bruno Conti. It's a bit long. I will post it bit by bit here. It says, thank you, Breno, for the stimulating exposition. I'd like a comment on the absence of a very explicit reference to the mover in the formulation of 3.1. And then he proposes an argument for comments. I'm not sure if it's the same. He posted everything in sequence. So he says, I propose an argument for comment, perhaps in favor of interpretation B, without speaking of actually, potentially, etc. And the argument goes as follows. Bricks, etc., potentially a house are buildable. Oikodometon. The buildable as such is potentially a house. There is no buildable without a builder. And it ends, therefore, bricks, qua bricks, remain such in the absence of the builder. Therefore, the bricks, simply qua bricks, are not potentially a house. Would you like me to go back to the first part of the argument, to the first comment?
No, I think I understand. The bricks, qua bricks, are not potentially a house. That's... I'm not sure what that means exactly, but perhaps what you are saying is that the bricks, I will avoid the qua clause to refer to that thing. So the bricks, bricks, if you mean, perhaps Bruno thinks of the bricks when they are lying on the floor without the presence of an agent, a builder, or something like that. You're saying that the bricks are no longer buildable. Well, I think this is wrong. In order to answer that question, we need to go to metaphysics theta. And I agree with Dave Charles about theta. And when Aristotle is precisely extending his model for rational capacities to non-rational and internal capacities, I think that he is committing to the view that the bricks are potentially the bricks are buildable if they have the categorical basis to undergo the process of building. And of course, they cannot be actually built if the building requires, in addition, the acting of an agent. That's of course. But I think Aristotle's point is that once the bricks and stones, once that nothing needs to be added to the bricks and stones, etc., for the builder to act on them, then the bricks and stones are already potentially a house. The builder is sleeping. The builder is dead. Is I don't know. Is absent. Is on vacation. It doesn't matter. If the bricks and stones have or present the categorical basis for undergoing the process, then the bricks are potentially the bricks and stones are potentially a house. So your premise, you say that there is no buildable without a builder. if you talk about like, if you are talking about the buildable as a type and the builder as a type, you are correct. There is no such thing as a passive capacity without the corresponding active capacity. But this doesn't make your conclusion true the head about like that. If all builders suddenly are dead, that doesn't mean that the bricks are not buildable anymore. As long as someone remains capable of learning the art of building, and as long as the bricks are ready to be acted on by a builder, I think that for Aristotle, given theta, the bricks are still buildable, right? So it depends on how you read your premise number 3, whether you're talking about builder as types or as tokens, or if you're talking the dictor or the hair. It's very complicated, but I think that we have textual evidence against your conclusion in theta. It's not a very satisfying reply, Bruno, but I'll be happy to discuss with you and meet theta with you in some other opportunity to explain my position in a better way. But I don't have a personal reading of theta. I'm agreeing with Dave Charles and how he employs theta to defend his reading of the text in physics. It's not very satisfying, I know, but that's the kind of answer I can give at this moment.
Okay, I've asked in the chat from YouTube if anybody has any more questions. There hasn't been any replies, so I think we're through with the audience questions. Unless you guys here have more questions, I think we can finish our session for today. Roberto has one. Please, Roberto. Your microphone is closed, Roberto. You have to open it up.
Yes, and so one of the last things that you said when you were defending the virtues of Aristotle's account, even if it's not an analysis, you say something like that Aristotle says something that involves that change is not its own telos, but is governed by an end state extrinsic to the change itself. So I was curious about changes that are like, it seems that they have no telos. So, or that they have a telos that is not the natural telos. So like the change of a purely accidental quality, or the change of something that is against nature would be like when we force Earth to go up, for example, with some machine or something like that. In what sense this would be a change that is guided by a telos? Maybe I'm reading too much into this telos there, but this was just my
I think that the position, for instance, when a pitcher is throwing a baseball, the telos, it suffices to be a telos in the sense I'm employing here, just the final position that the pitcher intends the ball to be. So that suffices as a telos for the chain, so for the pitch as a process, right? And then, of course, we have the natural movement of the elements, which is also governed by a teleological causation. And about a chance process governed by chance, I think there is a chance is not that depends on how you understand chance in Aristotle, but I think that chance is not a governing force on its own. It's not like a concrete cause modifying the natural states of things. And I agree with Lucas that has a more sophisticated interpretation of what is going on in chapters 4 to 6 in the second book of the physics. that change is a sort of combinations of a parallel series of events that are governed by their own causes, and they end up coinciding somehow, and that's how change is something that explains things in the world. So it's just the combination of two causal series that are not governed from the beginning by the same original cause. It's complicated, but I think that there is something like that going on. I think one thing that is problematic, and I would like to mention that because it is more problematic to interpretation B than to interpretation A, but it's kind of problematic to my account as well, which is the eternal movements in Aristotle. So eternal movements are not the kind of change or process that is directed at a given end state. They have more like the properties of activities in Aristotle. That's why they are perfect movements and so on. And it is a little bit, it is, I think, very difficult to characterize eternal movements in terms of constitutive actualities, as Kosman proposes. But I at least have one solution to that problem, is to say that I characterize this change as the capacity to change. And eternal movements is just a realization of something's capacity to change in that particular way. My problem concerns only the grammar of the definition in 3.1. And I think in the grammar, in 3.1, Aristotle is not interested particularly on eternal movements. He's explicitly interested in processes that have an end state. And that's precisely the reason why he opens the chapter by talking about potentiality and actuality throughout the categories, because he's thinking about the initial and the end state of a given process. So he's speaking with the framework of the first book of the physics. And that's, I mean, that would be my answer. I'm not sure if that satisfies you. But,
Yes. Oh, thank you.
Any more questions? Anybody? Rodrigo, Roberto, Lucas? I know Lucas is a bit pressed for time. Since we have no more questions in the chat either, I think we can close it here. Thanks everybody for coming, all the audience and all of our debaters, and especially Breno here for the excellent presentation.
I am grateful.
Hope to see you all guys soon. We will confirm the date for the next lecture soon enough. We're talking with Professor Karbowski this week just to hammer out the time and the date. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. See you soon.
Bye-bye.